Hello witches, it's Keldon. I hope you're all doing well. Today I wanted to make a video that's a little bit of a ramble, a little bit of a story time, a little bit of everything, I guess. So it started off with an experience I had early this morning where I was banned from a Facebook group, which I'm not upset about. I think it's rather funny. But I guess I'm a little bit of a rebel in that sense. So what happened? I posted a link to my latest blog post, which is about the narratives around the witches' Sabbath that emerged during some of the Swedish witch trials. And the person who runs this group was unfortunately really offended by this article. And tried to have a conversation with them about it. In particular, they were really offended about the aspects of working with the devil. And they were very adamant, that the devil has no place in witchcraft. And this is where I stepped in a little bit more because I work with the devil. And I know many witches who do work with the devil. That's pretty common in traditional witchcraft. And so I simply stated, well, that's true for a lot of witches, but not all witches. We can't necessarily make these big brushstrokes of what all witches do or what all witches don't do, right? It's a really diverse community with a lot of different beliefs and practices. And they clapped back with, no, you don't. You work with the pagan god. And I don't know why I was so surprised by this, because I know that this kind of behavior happens, but just to have somebody who you don't know, right? I don't know this person, they don't know me, feel like they have the authority to tell me who I work with in my spiritual practice, as if they know better than me about the spirits that I've worked with for years. It's really weird, and it's honestly, it's bullshit, and it's rude. It doesn't matter who you're working with, or who the other person's working with. Like, you just don't do that. You don't tell somebody, like, oh, no, you don't work with that spirit. You actually work with this spirit. That's not how that works. And that's how I replied. I just said, please don't tell me who I work with. That's really rude. They proceeded to tell me that I was going to be banned from the group, and that was the experience. I'm not upset by it, per se. It's just something that kind of triggered more thoughts of things to talk about. Specifically working with the devil. I've made a video in the past about this, and I've written a blog post that pretty much covered the same material. So I'll put links to those down below. I also talk about it even more extensively in my upcoming book. I'll put a link to that as well. So if you're like, this video is a lot of random psychobabble, you can turn to those sources for more eloquent expressions of my thoughts. Otherwise, here we go. So right away, I make it a point to acknowledge that not all witches work with the devil. I feel like that's pretty obvious, because not all witches work with the same spirits or spirits at all. That's fine. There's space for all of us in this community, which is so awesome. I also acknowledge that this is a really contentious topic that brings up a lot of very visceral reactions in people, whether you're a witch or you're not. So looking at some of the historical context of this, there has been a really big push since the revival of witchcraft started in the 1950s, of like, nope, no devil in the craft. The devil has nothing to do with it. It's a Christian construct. Nope. And a lot of that has to do with witchcraft adjusting to being known socially, right? So prior to the 1950s, witchcraft was still illegal. It was no longer a capital offense at that time, but it was still punishable by fines and possibly being put in jail. So people couldn't really talk about being witches or practicing witchcraft or writing books about how to practice witchcraft. All that changes in the 1950s. So you get people like Gerald Gardner and Dorothy Valiente and so on and so forth coming out with their visions and traditions of witchcraft. And as part of that, they have to make it socially palatable because it's getting so much public attention. And although you couldn't be legally punished per se for being a witch, you could still be significantly harassed. Also, it's important to note here too that in certain areas of the world, it still is illegal to be a witch or be accused of being a witch, and that could even mean being executed. So it's not, it's not as simple as like, oh, we're all safe to be out and doing our thing. Anyways, so right. So some people have really harshly referred to this as like the watering down or sugarcoating of witchcraft. Because prior to this witchcraft revival and kind of the growing neo-pagan movement, witches and the devil went hand in hand. When you look into historical texts, when you look into the folklore of witchcraft, the devil is rampant. And while you do find in certain areas mentions of certain like female spirits or deities, you don't really find mentions of any of the popular pagan gods today, like Pan or Herne. So, but you find the devil. So what does it mean to work with the devil? Who is the devil then exactly? Am I talking about the Christian Satan? Not quite. And I can only speak really for my experience. I'm not going to speak for all witches who work with the devil and how they interpret him. So this is just my perspective. The way I look at it is that throughout time, different pagan deities, local land spirits, the fair folk, they start to become demonized, right? As Christianity spreads. There's that whole notion of like, any being that's not the Christian God is of the devil. And so all of these things are being amassed under this title. And at this point, I usually always turn to this quote by Gemma Gary, because I think she really perfectly describes my thoughts on this matter. So I'm going to read that to you. I probably read it in my other video too. So, and I quote it in my book. I just love this quote a lot. And I bookmarked it, but okay, so she says, "Yet, ironically, it may perhaps be the church in its keenness to eradicate adherence to pagan divinity by grafting and projecting it onto the diabolical that has unwittingly, most thoroughly preserved the potency, liberation, and illumination of the old one, and handed him back to the witches as the devil." Some of those spirits, some of those divinities, their legacy lives on and survives because they were preserved under that name and transposed into popular folklore. Now this brings up the question that I've been asked about, well, if the devil is really just all of these kind of amassed spirits and gods and fairies and stuff like that, why don't you call them by those names? Well, I could, and sometimes I do. But for me, the name devil fits within the folklore that I'm pulling inspiration from in my practice. It fits within my overall beliefs. It just fits. When I started my my witchcraft journey, for a long time I didn't work with any type of masculine, male deity or spirit. And eventually, over the years, I was trying to fit that into my practice, and I worked with different pagan gods, and it just didn't fit. It never felt right until I started working with the devil. It clicked. It felt like home. It felt powerful. It was like this new awakening and this new presence in my life that just felt right. So just going just really briefly into more about kind of my views on the devil is that he really is all things and no things at the same time. I see him as this master of contradictions and mysteries. A lot of times you'll hear phrases like the light betwixt the horns, which is the divine illumination that he gives to us. He's a master of initiation and knowledge and freedom and liberation. When we look at a lot of the things that the devil was supposedly kind of in charge of, when we look into like specifically the transcripts of witch trials and stuff, a lot of those things that he stood for are things like, again, knowledge, liberation, music, feasting, sex, like all things that most pagans really, really enjoy. So if, I was given the choice between, well, you can go with our very staunch Christian God who's like suppress basically all of your human tendencies, or this other being who's like, let's dance and fuck and eat good food. I'm gonna go with the devil. But he's also nature, right? He's embodied in all of that. We see that personified in a lot of place names. So when you go around, a lot of times like in national parks or other areas, there's places like, Devil's Kettle, Devil's Lake, Devil's Punch Bowl, Devil's Ditch, like all these things, right? It's because the idea is that the devil formed those pieces of land because he is the land. Other manifestations as they pop up through folklore, like the leader of the Wild Hunt, the Green Man, all these things. He's all of these things at once. But he can't be pigeonholed into any of them, which is also why I don't necessarily feel drawn to like using one particular name over the other. Some of this too I should note. So when we think of like polytheism, sometimes it's broken down into like hard and soft polytheism. So hard polytheism is like all gods are separate, individual, independent beings, versus like soft polytheism is usually like all gods ultimately are one. I'm somewhere in the middle. I believe that they are all independent, but they all come back to the same, which I don't know if that makes sense to other people outside of my head. I guess I also think about it as people, right? Like, we're all individual people, but ultimately we're all somehow spiritually connected. We all go back to the same place, the same root system, the same blah, blah, blah. So having that placeholder of the devil really fits for me. And sometimes that's how I view it too, as kind of a placeholder. So like when we think about maybe other terms that we're familiar with, like in Wicca, like the Lord and the Lady, those are kind of placeholder names for other spirits, other deities. Just like I use the terms witch father and witch mother a lot. Those are more general. Those are more kind of those overarching names. So anyways, I don't know if this video was very coherent at all. I feel like I say that at the end of all my videos, which I probably also say that at the end of my videos. I definitely think I'm better on paper than in videos. But I hope it made sense. If you have questions, leave them below in the comments. Please be respectful. I know that some of you watching this will be like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? This is super offensive. But let's have a conversation about it. Let's not attack each other. Let's just talk. Because that's how we reach understanding. And if you want to know even more information, check out the links that I'll leave below. But until next time, take care.